Elaine Dewar is an award-winning author, journalist, investigative journalist. So it was no surprise that in the early days of COVID, a publisher asked her to do a quick book on the inevitable pandemic profiteering that would unfold. She said no and countered with an offer to look instead at the origins of this virus. There was already much speculation about lab leaks and the problems with gain-of-function research, lots of issues. But Elaine also argued that this was worth a book because it's such a smart virus. The result of all this work is The Origin of the Deadliest Virus in 100 Years. Elaine, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
That's great. Millions have died, many unnecessarily, not just because China lied, but because we failed to act in the right way. We had all the early warning signs from SARS in the mid-2000s. Is it really a smart virus, or were we in just some kind of strange form of denial?
Well, I think both are true. It is definitely a smart virus in that it has three different methods for entering human cells, and it appears to have been human adapted from the beginning. But more to the point, it doesn't kill too many. So a smart virus, in my view, is one that replicates really quickly and really easily, but doesn't kill off too many of its hosts, so it can keep circulating and circulating and circulating. As to what we failed to do, SARS, the original of 2003, led to a number of inquiries in this country because Canada, as well as China, was severely impacted by SARS.
Yeah.
And among the things that we were supposed to do was to keep a steady stream of personal protective equipment available in Ontario and at the federal level as well. Interestingly, both bureaucracies utterly failed to maintain those strategic piles. And no one appears to have noticed in the Public Health Agency of Canada, after a certain number of years had gone by, that we needed to keep our eye out for any kind of virus developing either in Canada or abroad, and to keep an early warning system up and running. And of course, what we did with ours was effectively shut it down in May of 2019. That early warning system was apparently relied upon to some degree by the WHO and by others. And by failing to keep it running, by failing to keep the Public Health Agency of Canada's eye on the ball, we left ourselves wide open.
Why do you think that is? If you're a doctor, if you are a politician, if you are a political leader, and something is coming at you like this, that is clearly deadly. We did not know how deadly at the beginning. Hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely, we did, Pamela. We knew from the 20th of January that it was incredibly serious.
Right.
Because on the 20th of January, all these papers are delivered by Chinese scientists to leading journals. And the president of China, Xi Jinping, announces that it's bad, that there's human-to-human transmission. And within days had locked down Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, and prevented anybody from getting on trains and planes at last, and started to build two massive hospitals on site to deal with what they obviously expected would be a huge onrush of patients. Now, you don't do that for fun. You do it because you're expecting a massive number of people to become extremely ill that is going to overwhelm your hospital system. From that point forward, any epidemiologist should have been paying close attention, and any government official should have been paying close attention.
In any country.
In any country, but specifically ours, where we have a very high standard of medical care, and we have terrific epidemiologists, and we have a public health agency apparently devoted to the study of public health dangers.
But my question stands, and I'm wondering what your theory is. So we know that, and the dates are important. I agree 1,000%. But why would we react the way we did? Why was there almost a a cover up of some of this data, or we don't need to worry about it, or if you stop planes, that'll be racist. Like, I'm not sure I
Used
understand.
was the risk is low. That was used by the Minister of Health,
Yeah.
by the head of the Public Health Agency of Canada until March, just after the pandemic was finally declared 6 weeks late
Right.
by the WHO. And if you ask me why, what was offered was that the algorithm that was being used was insufficient to the task. And what I'm just astonished by is that you would rely on an algorithm and avoid looking at what's on television every night and drawing conclusions from that. So why? I don't know why. And we need to find out why. We need to find out why.
It is puzzling.
Ask a lot of questions.
We know that, and we've heard this time and again, that, you know, politicians in many respects love a crisis because it allows them to hunker down, focus, and kind of ignore some of the rules that go on generally for doing things. But I don't think they could have anticipated that at the front end. It was more like a willful ignorance.
Yes, and you have to ask, why was that? And I think there's a larger issue here that I try to get at in the back of the book, which is the severing in a responsible government system of bureaucratic responsibility from political responsibility. We have a system in which the minister of a government agency or department is deemed to be the responsible party for anything good or bad that happens within that department. When was the last time you saw someone resign from political office for a failure in their department? Can you remember?
It's a very long time. There used to be ministerial accountability, and ministers did resign when something in their department happened that they might not even been aware of.
Exactly. And so we now have a system in which bureaucrats who have perhaps a reason to cover up or to not tell the minister something of importance are in effect given kudos by the minister, who is covering her ears because if she doesn't know, she cannot be held responsible. So we've got the exact opposite of a responsible government system at this present time. Not one person other than Premier Palliser has resigned, and there are 27,000 dead Canadians as a result of failures of policy.
Well, as you said, it cost Donald Trump his job in the US. I mean, that was a huge issue. And yet no one here, I mean, we've had some changes in terms of the presidents at the Public Health Agency of Canada.
But that resignation was explained as the president is tired and needs a break, not the president made mistakes.
Correct.
And we now have the former president who replaced the president who resigned being shuffled off as of this weekend back to the NRC without explanation.
Back to an old job without any explanation. I agree. You read these things and shake your head. I want to come back to just how you approach this story before we get into, because all those things we're reading now, of course, is that the Chinese knew about the presence of this virus way back. Military games were there. You write about minors being infected, and I want to come to that. But you talk about sort of halfway through this process, and you're very IF Stonish in your approach, that you read the basic documents. You're not out doing fancy interviews with people and taking them at their word. But you began to have a little bit of doubt yourself and saying, am I getting too far into this? Are these conspiracy theories just so compelling when you're writing that you just, how did that occur, and what broke you out of it?
You know, the problem for any journalist is that you enter a story probably with something in the way of a framework. Otherwise, where do you start? So I think that I had real concern that I was predisposed to a lab leak idea. And I liked that idea because, in effect, it meant that human beings had some control over what goes on in the world around us. And that the nature spillover argument, which for the first year and a half was the only one that was considered viable,
Right.
Was actually quite scary because, if nature can do this at the drop of a whatever, we're all in serious trouble. So there's a natural predisposition for me to look hard at the lab leak thing and to look less hard at the natural spillover. They had enough of their defenders. They didn't need me.
Right.
But that raises the question for any journalist, are you being fair? If you've got a predisposition, are you countering that? Are you arguing with yourself? Are you demanding that you prove it to yourself? And by the end of the book, I think I got to the point where I felt fairly confident that I had proven it to myself as best I could do.
Yeah. No, I think that's where a lot of people were starting to see the news organizations that just fell for the official line, hook, line, and sinker, are now starting to say, well, of course, these are the problems with the Wuhan lab, and here's what we didn't know at the time and should have been told. I come back to this, and we've talked about it a lot on the podcast, which is somehow this seems to me would have gone so much better if people simply would have told the truth. And I'm not being Pollyanna here. Obviously, it would have helped if China had done that right off the top. I'm just saying the basic stuff. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. This is maybe transmitted human to human. So let's do this. Let's stop some flights till we figure out what's going on. But we kept being lied to. You're
talking about the precautionary principle, which should have prevailed. And that was one of the most strange things to me, that instead of operating on the possibility that this was really serious and we could have a serious problem, it was the risk is low, the risk is low, the risk is low. The most ridiculous one that appeared in my Globe and Mail one morning was someone at the Ottawa Citizen apparently spoke to Public Health Agency of Canada early on and said, what's the risk to Canadians? And the answer was, the risk to Canadians is low because there's no direct flight from Wuhan to Canada. What do you say?
No, it's just crazy. And in fact, at that time, I was in Vancouver at an airport, and there are
people getting off the plane from China, all kinds of places.
China all day long, all night long, whether they had to take another flight to get from Wuhan or not.
Absolutely.
That is one of the problems, though. I mean, Wuhan is one of those centers. You call it China's Chicago. It's a port city. It has direct flights to almost every country in the world, with the exception of Canada, a direct flight.
Right.
But that the tentacles would reach quickly and far and wide.
There was an epidemiological study that I read that was submitted on the 31st of January of 2020, which basically said by that point, SARS-CoV-2 had been seeded in all of the major cities of China, all of the major cities which had direct international connections. The estimate of the number of cases, I think in that paper, was already over 3,000 that were known. And so you have logarithmic growth in cases, and it's worldwide spread already. The government of China, we now know, thanks to the AP, knew by the 14th of January that they had a pandemic on their hands and said nothing to anyone until the 20th. Every day counts. Every day.
This is just a sidebar, but what should we be doing about that? I mean, China doesn't care if we're mad. China doesn't care if we slap their wrists. We've just been through all of this with the two Michaels. For a country to do that literally to the rest of the world, you then have to say, what is this? Is this just hiding for their own domestic populations? They don't want to admit mistakes. They're perfect. They're the leadership. Or was there some intent?
I don't know if you read Woodward's book, Rage, but Matthew Pottinger, who was the national security deputy, who had terrific contacts in China from his days at the Wall Street Journal covering SARS, the original, heard very early on from his contacts in China that there had been a decision made to let it escape. If China was going to suffer, everybody else would be allowed to suffer too. Whether that's true or false, I don't know, but it has a certain ring to me that there's no question in my mind that China did not create this virus for the purpose of a bioweapon,
Right.
or release it on purpose. This is an accident, and a terrible accident, and they didn't want to own up. Now, what do we do about it? I think I would argue with you with regard to the two Michaels. Obviously, when Canada began to organize with other Western nations about hostage diplomacy and got 60 countries to sign on, that had an impact. Otherwise, I don't think the two Michaels would be home.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that the Americans decided they would, take a plea deal from Meng, and voila, they were on the plane.
Yeah, but there wasn't a voila, there was an and also. And the question is, would they have settled for getting her out of Dodge and keeping the two Michaels in prison? I don't know. But I think the Chinese had as much of a need to get out of this mess as the Americans had a need to shut it down, and we had a need to have it resolved. So I don't think it's so simple as we have no leverage, we have no power. I think we do have leverage and we do have power, and we have to use it.
Yeah, I guess that's the more operative point, which is you have to be prepared to use it.
You have to be prepared, and you have to take it when they punch back, which they will do.
Yeah, as Australia and others have found out.
Absolutely.
Okay, I want to come back. We've wandered off into all these interesting areas, but I want to come back to what you really think happened at the lab in Wuhan. We'll talk about the impact on the lab in Canada and Winnipeg as well. But what do you think happened?
We know now, thanks to a guy called 𝘕𝘰 𝘕𝘰𝘯𝘓, that in 2012, there were 6 miners who entered into a bat-infested mine in Mojiang County in Yunnan, which is in the southwest of China. And 3 of them immediately became sick. 3 more guys go in to take their place. They get sick. They end up in Kunming in a hospital where they were for many months suffering from something that appeared to be SARS-like, the original SARS. So a terrible pneumonia, which they could not fight off, which did not respond to antifungals or antibiotics or any of the known antivirals. They sent samples to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, specifically to a woman named 𝘕𝘰 𝘕𝘰𝘯𝘴𝘦, who is their leading coronavirus expert and had been since about 2004. And they also sent samples to a guy named Zhongnan Shen, who was the guy who solved the original SARS problem. The hierarchy in China had deemed it to be caused by chlamydia, a bacteria, and we're treating it with antibiotics. He finally said, no, it's not. It's a virus, and you treat it with a steroid. Anyway, she had 13 samples from those miners' lungs and apparently published nothing about them for the next 7 years. So that is very strange on its face. 2 scientists in the US, Jonathan Latham and Allison Wilson, his partner, published a thesis, which I refer to in the book at some length, about how it was that SARS-CoV-2 became so well adapted to human beings. And his argument and Allison's argument is that it adapted itself to those human beings in their lungs, where it was infecting and reinfecting different parts of their bodies over the course of something on the order of 5 months. Samples shipped to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where certainly studies were done. It is impossible to imagine that when you have a SARS-like pneumonia killing 50% of the people who are infected by it, that the first thing you do is to actually try and sequence whatever it is in those samples, or try and isolate whatever may be circulating in those samples. They may have failed to isolate, but there is no way they failed to genome sequence what was found in those samples. And yet they published nothing about them. So my thesis is They did indeed do genome sequences. They found something really interesting. They proceeded to experiment with that something very interesting. And several years later, they had an accident.
So this is somebody being infected in the lab and
Yep.
leaving or
Yep.
having it on their clothes, or we don't know.
God knows. Well, we do know that, we think we know, that 3 researchers from 𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘰𝘠𝘢𝘕𝘰𝘠𝑙𝑦 lab became ill in November of 2019, and exactly the point at which the virus explodes into the population of Wuhan, ended up having hospital treatment. What we don't know is what they were infected with, what the diagnosis was. We don't know who they were, but it's really suspicious.
And do you think that research that 𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘰𝘠𝘢𝘕𝘰𝘠𝑙𝑦 was doing was not published because she chose not to do it, or because officialdom came down on her and said, this is not going to be discussed internationally?
From the time that Xi Jinping assumed power in China, the formal divisions between military, medical, and non-military was erased. The Wuhan Institute of Virology had been seen by the rest of the world to be a civilian institution. However, I don't think it's reasonable for anyone to say that civilians were the only people going in and out of that lab. We know from 2017 for certain that military people were in that lab. We know that in particular, a gal by the name of Shen Wei, who is the Major General in the People's Liberation Army, was working there on SARS-CoV-2, created the first vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 in that lab. In other words, no separation. We know that many, many groups, including military groups, were searching in the, the lab in,
Okay.
were searching in that mine for viruses that might have caused that infection. But we also know that in very few circumstances, when they published papers about those findings, they almost never mentioned the miners getting sick. Okay. So there was a separation between the product of the work done in the mine and the reason for going there in the first place. And that suggests to me orders from on high. You were not to discuss.
What is your assessment of the still ongoing debate over gain of function research, and who you write extensively about Peter Daszak at the EcoHealth Alliance and his connections with Fauci? Let's just go back and on the basics. What do you think was that kind of research being done there? Are you
we know it was being done there. We know what they published. Certainly the first obvious gain of function paper done by 𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘰𝘠𝘢𝑙𝑦 was with a guy named Ralph Baric at University of North Carolina. Ralph Baric is the American lead expert on coronaviruses, and they made chimeras. So take a piece of one virus and put it together with another virus and see what you get. And then they put those chimeras into humanized mice and human cells to see what would happen. And what they found was that after a certain number of passages, time for the viruses to get adapted to where they were, they got very sick mice. So a virus that should not have infected mice was successfully infecting and making mice sick. That is a gain of function experiment where you expand the host range of a virus. So we know that they were doing those experiments for 2015, but the other kinds of work that was being done that is always sort of dropped out of the discussion is synthetic biology, where if you have the genome sequence of a virus or a genome sequence that might be a virus, you put it together in E. coli, you get commercial labs to make chunks of the sequence. They are put into an E. coli system or a yeast system, and out pops a viable virus. So you don't need to have an isolated virus to do that. You need to have a genome sequence that is whole enough that when you put it into E. coli, it will be put together and come out the other end. And clearly they've been doing that kind of work for many years.
So the purpose is theoretically to then develop something to protect against it, i.e. a vaccine or perhaps some kind of medicine. Is there any evidence that that work was being done?
We know that vaccine development was going on there, but I haven't seen any publications by 𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘰𝘠𝘕 on vaccine making. What I've seen by her and her colleagues is all kinds of papers on coronaviruses that have been found among bats and other critters, including pigs, and trying to see how it is that bats can carry so many of these serious viruses, not just coronavirus, but Ebola, et cetera, and not be made ill by them. So that was the focus of their work. Peter Daszak has always said that the purpose of this work is to get ahead of nature, to be able to have vaccines at the ready. But the failure rate is 100%.
So what was the game at EcoHealth Alliance? They were being funded by by
everybody,
by the government, by everybody. They were getting grants from wealthy individuals.
They got grants from NIH. They got grants from NIAID, which is National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. They got grants from USAID through its PREDICT program. And we're talking $67 million from USAID. I'm not, the total from NIH is small by comparison, but their next biggest funder is the US Department of Defense through the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And they have a number of labs. I mean, they weren't just working in China, they were working in the stands, as Daszak calls them, and throughout South Asia, looking for possible spillovers in what are known as viral hotspots. This is using a charity, which is what EcoHealth Alliance is, to fund labs in foreign places over which you have no regulatory authority, strikes me as nuts.
Yeah,
I've been doing it for since 2009.
And again, your theory about to what end? Nobody wants to have people developing viruses in level 2 labs that aren't secure. And yet
she said she was doing exactly that. And she was doing it with US money.
So where do we come into the picture, and the two so-called Chinese spies, at least Chinese scientists with defense connections, military connections?
Well, we can't say that they're spies. We don't know what they
You're quite right. Alleged spies. I'm not even willing to go that far. I'm willing to say people of use to the government of China, which is different from being a spy. That's very fair. That's very, very fair. How do they end up here? Did we not do a background check?
Oh, God.
What were they doing? Just some obvious questions here, Elaine.
They arrive, I think, in 1997. In 1996, there seems to have been an explosion of PhD and master's students leaving China and coming to the major universities of the world. So Oxford, Cambridge, University of Texas, University of California, and University of Manitoba. These guys, 𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘰𝘠𝘕 and 𝘕𝘰𝘕𝘕𝘠𝘕, who appear to be a couple, actually arrived first at University of Texas, MD Anderson, in 1996. She had a medical degree and MSc in immunology. I have absolutely no information on what he had, but he seems to have been the guy who was the person who got them into a lab run by a fellow named Moshe Talpaz, who is a very serious expert on leukemia. So they come to the United States, they're looking at blood cancers, and within 2 years, they're in Winnipeg. And the question would be, why on earth would you go from University of Texas, which is a great institution, to the University of Manitoba, which is much smaller, much fewer resources, to do postgraduate work? Why? No answer to that question. And yet, by 2003, SARS, 𝘰𝘕𝘕𝘕𝘕𝘕𝘕𝘕𝘕𝘕, the husband, is working with Francis Plummer who was then the head of the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg, and also an adjunct professor at University of Manitoba. Within about 15 minutes, they're working on a SARS paper. And by June of that year, 𝘕𝘰𝘢𝘱𝘰𝘢𝘱, the wife, is working full-time at the National Microbiology Laboratory. She's gone from being an expert on leukemias and blood cancers to suddenly working on Ebola. And that's not obvious. I mean, to work, immunology is a big bag, but still, that's not obvious. Within 2 years, she's in the level 4 biosafety lab working with a guy named 𝘕𝘰 𝘕𝘰𝘯𝘥𝘦𝘮𝑛𝑦𝑡𝑟 on Ebola, and Heinz Feldman working on Ebola. And then about 2014, her husband has now left the University of Manitoba, where he was either a graduate student or working within labs, and has also joined the NML. And a year after that, a fellow by the name of George Gao, who is the head of the China Center for Disease Control and Prevention now, but was then a rising scholar in various labs across China, educated at Oxford, educated at Harvard, and even educated at the University of Calgary for a little time, did a paper with 𝘕𝘰𝘢𝘱𝘰𝘢𝘱 on Ebola, on treatments for Ebola.
Mm-hmm.
By the next year, a gal named 𝘠𝘕𝑚 is also doing work with 𝘕𝘰𝘢𝘱𝘰𝘢𝘱 on Ebola. In this case, it was testing 𝘠𝘕𝑚's vaccine for Ebola in the Winnipeg lab, on animals in the Winnipeg lab. And the question would be why? And the answer would be there was no level 4 available for use in China. And until 2018, the level 4 that was finally built in China was still unable to import Ebola, which is not endemic in China, until the end of that year. So if you wanted to work on Ebola, and a lot of Chinese scholars wanted to work on Ebola, you couldn't do it. You couldn't actually work with the virus in any labs in China. Thus, Canada becomes very important.
And our kind of open door policy and come on down and our unquestioning
well, there's just a host of military researchers from China who are traipsing through the door, apparently having no problem with access, although you need a secret clearance in order to work in that lab. And we know that because they're publishing papers in learned journals with their names attached. In the case of 𝘕𝘰𝘢𝘱𝘰𝘢𝘱, because Western journals usually use the Western method of naming, her papers were Wei Chen, and her Beijing Institute of Biotechnology was the only affiliation given on the papers. But anybody who knew anything about how China organizes military medicine would know that that institute falls within the military medical division in China. So there's this major general doing 2 major papers in Winnipeg. Don't know whether she was actually setting foot in the lab, doesn't matter. A secret clearance includes data, not simply access to the lab. And nobody seemed to get upset or concerned or raise any kind of commotion until the story comes out that we have shipped 15 strains of Ebola to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in 2019. And shortly after that, these 2 are marched out of the lab. Their secret clearances withdrawn. CBC did a great job of bringing that story to the public. Winnipeg Free Press also. But there was literally no follow-up from the government of Canada. No one explained nothing.
So I don't know. We've both been in the world of journalism for a long time, on and off. How and why are they getting away with this? Blocking any access to documents, even if it's not just domestic journalism. One would think there would be questions coming from people following this in Europe and in the United States and here. Why is there no more pressure to
No
actually,
repercussions, you mean?
yeah.
I can't answer that question, except to say that in my many years in this game, I've noticed that things that happen in Canada that are really quite serious never seem to move beyond the border. And I don't know if that's because nobody cares or because Canada doesn't count, or I can't explain it. I mean, to me, it's ridiculous that our allies would not be raising abundant numbers of questions about this.
Right.
And maybe because we're so good at quiet diplomacy, they're good at it too, and they're not raising a fuss in public. But if I'm the United States, I'm upset. If I'm the Brits, I'm upset. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me.
That's
you guys on the conservative side,
yeah,
actually tried to hold the feet to the fire.
Yeah.
And what happened? I mean, that story of dragging out the production of unredacted documents about the firing right until the House rises is awful. And then suing the speaker?
No, it was a gong show. It was a complete gong show. And that's what I mean. I mean, you sit back, you watch all of that unfold in real time. I read through your book, which is, all of just capturing these moments and events as they unfold. And I'm sitting here puzzled whether I simply don't understand how the world works anymore, or as you say, why people wouldn't be desperate to find out the details of this so that we don't kill millions more people another time.
Well, I'm not sure that we killed anybody.
No, but I'm saying the world, right. Without getting to the bottom of this, how do we prevent it again?
Politics, I think, as you know much better than I do, is about compromise. It's about making common cause. It's about finding allies, and it's about advancing your case. And I think what is so frightening to me as a Canadian who loves this country, I mean, get off a plane, come home, I fall to my knees, I want to kiss the ground, because so much of what we do here is so good and so right. But when it comes to holding government to account, we're just bloody awful. And we have to do better. We have to do better. And it's up to you, Senator.
Yeah.
Do it. I mean, what's going on in the Senate of Canada that you guys are not holding committee hearings and dragging people in front of you and saying, testify or else?
Yes, I wish that went on in this country in a much more, I look with envy at how the Senate functions on the state side and their ability to command witnesses.
But do we not have the same legal powers? I mean, if you're sitting in a committee and you want someone to come before you, do you not have the right to say, here's a subpoena or the equivalent, appear or there will be consequences? Answer.
Not exactly. And here's the larger issue, as you put your finger on before, is that these committees are largely dominated by government of the day.
Right.
So, if all these questions are put to a vote, let's have a vote on whether or not we're going to call this witness. Then you generally know how the vote's going to go, right?
Unless you have a minority government, which we now have. Yeah. And suddenly you have some reins in your hands. So. Yeah.
That's what I think everybody will be looking for at this point. What's the one outstanding thing? The book is published, it's done, it's out there. What are you waiting for to learn?
I'm waiting to see if something happens to change the tenor of what goes on at the WHO, which has been remarkably passive in the face of just something so horrible. Clearly there is a problem there. And when a government, China, who's one of the smallest donors, is able to manage and manipulate how the WHO goes about its business, we have a serious problem as a globe. I mean, it's not just a Canadian problem, it's everybody's problem. So I'm waiting to see what happens there. I'm waiting to see what happens to Peter Daszak, because honestly, what this book shows is huge amounts of money running through the hands of a charity, which is a way of offloading responsibility for extremely dangerous experiments done elsewhere. Something has to give in that regard.
Elaine, thank you for your work and keeping at this and saying no to the book about, pandemic profiteering and saying, let me write this one instead. I'm glad you did.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much. Elaine Dewar, the author of The Origin of the Deadliest Pandemic in 100 Years. It's a basic approach you've taken to this, and it's good work. Thanks so much. We'll talk soon. Great.
Okay.
And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll talk again soon.